Welcome, listeners of Illusion to Temporal Discussion, the episode-by-episode Knightmare retrospective podcast. I'm Martin Harder, and with me today, obviously, is Martin O'Doney, and we've got a very special guest here as well. TV producer, did a few shows you might recognise, like Time Busters and the Satellite Game, and what was that other one? Oh yes, Knightmare. We're very pleased to be able to welcome Tim Child with us today.
Or as the politician, Lord Buckethead.
You would be able to if only he were with us, of course. Actually, he is, because it's 34 degrees up in this gantry.
Yes.
I can't keep this thing on for any longer.
Which brings us to an apology for our listeners at the moment. As stated, it is 34 degrees at the moment. So we've got fans on, we've got windows open. There's likely to be some background noise. I apologise for that. But there's no way, absolutely, I don't know about you guys, but there's absolutely no way I can do this without a fan on.
No. Just the heat from the computers is enough to drive you over the top. So I think unavoidable, yes. We've apparently got a thunderstorm heading our way in Manchester as well, so we might get some background noise from that.
Okay, well, at least it'll clear the air a bit for you.
Hopefully, yeah.
Right, so, Tim, so we're going to avoid asking you questions about, you know, how the show came about and stuff like that. There's plenty of articles online about it. There's a particularly good one by The Guardian, I think. And obviously there's an in-depth article on Knightmare.com as well. But to start off with, you originally called the show Dungeon Doom, which I think we can all agree it's probably... was a good move to change the name. But how did you come up with the name Knightmare to replace it?
Oh, well, you're right about Dungeon Doom. It really was begging to be replaced by something. And it's one of those situations where you have a project and you think, well, hang on a second. First thing comes into your head, which is usually a bad idea, came into mind. And then you thought, well, hang on a second. I think we might need to do something a little bit better than that. And I suppose that what I was thinking all along was I was trying to avoid a sort of dungeon-based quiz program, which I failed in the first series to do because I hadn't really worked out the rest of the narrative build and things like that. But I had started off with an ambition, and that was it should be some sort of quest. And then, of course, you start thinking about all the classic quests like Grail Quest and things like that. And then you realize that most of these are related to the whole idea of knighthood, right? And chivalry and right and wrong and the strong defending the weak, etc., etc., etc. So I suddenly thought, well, hang on a second. I didn't think of Knightmare without the K first. Actually, I thought of Knight first. That's the truth of it.
Yeah,
and that's the reason for Knightmare. And it works because it's got two meanings. It's a play on nightmare. You know, something terrible happening to you, and my God, it did too. We made sure it did. And also we got the night business in there. So it gave us a focus for designer quests, which we did, they were little more than symbolic things, but it's always good to give somebody a target, if you know what I mean. Even if they're going to die embarrassingly sometime in August and before returning to their school in September, to be pilloried by all of their school friends, you know.
And that really is a nightmare.
Yeah, that really is. They didn't care about losing in the dungeon. It was facing the people back at school they were worried about. You know?
Exactly.
Absolutely.
We've had a few reports along those lines. We've spoken to Scott Evans recently, the kid who tried to jump the gap in Merlin's throne room, and he was absolutely dreading going back to school afterwards. I think it's interesting because that the original theme song you used for the pilot, I think, was the theme from Sorcerer, wasn't it?
You know what? I'd long forgotten that, but you told me that I shall now say yes. Of course it was. No, I still haven't bloody remember. You've got to realise that that in the early stages, when you're a development producer, you're trying an awful lot of things with the knowledge that you better start getting it right soon and stop pissing around with experimentations, because very soon it might actually be the real thing and you're making a series. It's desperately embarrassing when you're still playing around and experimenting, which unfortunately was actually, you probably guessed it, was exactly what we were doing in Knightmare Series 1 and Series 2. Well, in other words, we didn't know what we were doing.
There wasn't really anything else like it, was there?
Maybe
the BBC had a thing called the Adventure Game, which was run by a couple of professors, and it was very academic and sort of interesting, but it kept on locking up, mainly because it was run by people who weren't games people. I've always been a games person. I've always been a games player. And people say, well, and when they get surprised at that and think, well, hang on, but your background, you were a TV newsman and things like that. And the fact remains is you can't design games without being a player of games.
Definitely.
And I will always be a player of games. Nowadays, of course, I'm not nearly as good at them as I used to be, but there you go. So basically, what we were trying to do was to get something, first of all, past the Children's Committee at ITV, who had no understanding of adventure games at all. They didn't even understand the phrase. They didn't know what we were doing, right? And that was just so it was quite good that we didn't know what we were doing either, because between us all, nobody knew what they were doing.
It must have been very easy to bluff.
Well, they were very easy to, in the end, what we ended up with was what the long-serving head of BBC Children's, Anna Hume, called a continuous running development show. Now, TV moguls hate these. What they want to do is they want you to find a winning formula and then stick at it, right? Because there are no surprises and no risks, because everybody in this wonderful world of television is so remarkably risk-averse today, then, and will be in the future, I suspect.
I think that gets worse and worse as time passes, because attention spans tend to get shorter and shorter as generations pass as well. So people in TV now are terrified that if you haven't hooked the audience within the first 10 seconds, they're not going to.
Well, they see failures coming down the pike at them all the time, and of course, a lot of that's one of the reasons why, if anything, it is more risk averse and more difficult just to get something like Knightmare back on the screens again. Everybody gets terribly excited about Knightmare, and Knightmare is usually under option by one TV production company or another. At any time, about 80% of the last 20 years, it's been under option. In other words, people have been trying to bring it back. And they have largely failed because basically in the earlier times, it was impossible because it was no longer suitable for being a children's program. Now, one of the quick things that people ask me occasionally is why I wound up Knightmare. I didn't wind up Knightmare. It was wound up by the powers that be, which didn't want it to carry on, because although it was getting huge figures, most of those figures were adult and outside the age limits that
it was us.
Aiming at.
It was we were kids when it started.
That was all right, yeah. But the trouble is, you youngsters,
we grew up.
You grew old without growing up. If you know what I mean.
That's it. Yeah. Just to say, the way you say it's the powers that be. There, I always knew that deep down the powers that be were the bad guys in Knightmare. You just confirmed that. You got trade gods.
That I'm basically one of these woolly Guardian reading liberals, right? Okay, unfortunately, I believe in. I'm not at all religious, and that's an important thing to understand, because one of the problems with when you're playing around in the heroic fantasy area is that you walk through a minefield of semi-religious references and things like that, and you walk through a whole load of people who think that you're being religious when you're not. I'm a completely and totally a secular person, but I do like history. I do believe, I like the whole prospect of parallel universes and things like that. I believe they can be accommodated in drama. if you treat the subject with care and respect. And I think it's a very fertile area. The whole area of prehistory, heroic fantasy, and things like that runs parallel with sci-fi. When you're choosing your subject for an adventure game, you either go down one route or the other. In my view, you go down either heroic fantasy or you go down classic sci-fi. Yeah. I looked at both when I was thinking of how to run and get an adventure game onto children's television. And in the end, at that particular time, heroic fantasy was ever so slightly ahead in my leanings. So that was why Knightmare ended up as Knightmare and not Lost in Space or whatever else you want to call it. Yeah.
Space Mare. Well,
so you say that the powers that be didn't really understand adventure games or what you were trying to do. Is that why there was so much secrecy behind the filming of the pilot? Because I understand.
No, not really. The problem there was that there's a lot of answers to that particular question, and I'm just trying to give you the simplest one. To make not a pilot, but a test showing how the relationships between created backgrounds and real people in foreground could work involved the use of a big, powerful studio. The only studio of that nature at Anglia at the time, although later on there was another one and we used it for Knightmare, of course, was Studio A, which was the main drama studio. People like me, journos, even line producers, or people who then by then were working in development production for other things, we weren't the drama was the holy of holies. You couldn't get near the bookings thing even to do it. Right, so I had to make up a little lie which was convincing enough for them to feel not threatened by it. So in fact, we called the first on the roster for Studio A when I booked it. It said Chroma Key Experiment, and if anybody asked what the Chroma Key Experiment, I said, well, look, it's the new. They knew what we used in my field, Chroma Key 4. We used it for a bloke standing in front of a weather map. Right, we didn't tell them we were going to break all history of chroma key use, and first of all make an entire program out of it, which had never been done before. We didn't tell them we were going to break all the rules about vector graphics either, or fake VR before it ever even was ready to happen.
I wonder why not.
Because most of the time I didn't even know the answers to those questions myself.
Night meteorology. Give it a name, a development name.
No, you've got to gather now that it's very difficult to pin people down. Because once we start making it up as we go along, we're a bit like Boris Johnson, dangerous and should be put away. You know.
That is true. That is true.
You were one of the early adopters of VR, weren't you? I suppose one of the early pioneers of VR.
Yeah, and indeed, I went on to become the occasional co-chairman of the UK VR Forum, which was run by and funded by the Department of Trade and Industry throughout the early 90s, mainly because of Knightmare and also because of Televirtual, which was in some ways leading the way in virtual humans and picking up the tab for the fact that that broadsword television it didn't crash and burn, but we weren't going to be able to. As you probably know, in 1993, we lost 4 current series at the same time. It wasn't just Knightmare, it was the fact that we lost all the others. So we had to go back into development, and to go back into development would have cost us around about 6 million, which we didn't have. So the easiest thing was quite simply, we had already a sister company which we'd started off as an Anglo-American development, and we had got into live animation, real-time animation, or virtual humans as it's called in the trade. And we got there because I wanted to use those in Knightmare, and I did use those in Knightmare. Early versions of Vectors were used in Knightmare, and they were used again in Virtually Impossible, and in as many other programs. And we also took over, for one momentous 4 months, we took over all the presentation for BBC Children's. You know, at the then aptly named Broom Cupboard. which was the famous presentation area for children's BBC.
This fella's got an entire YouTube channel named after the broom cupboard, so you're definitely on his turf here.
Yeah, I think it's named after them rather than after you, but I'm not so sure about that. We'll have to find out.
Destroying our illusions there.
Yeah. Well, we all have illusions of eternity, don't we?
Grandeur. Yeah.
So again, it is very difficult to be both honest about Knightmare and amusing at the same time.
Oh, I don't know. I think the idea that you're fooling these rich, high-powered executives into taking an enormous risk with corporations'
well,
money
the biggest
very
problem,
amusing.
The biggest problem was not just the whole problem of, well, no, the biggest problem for them was that people didn't win. And I used to get notes although Anglia was the commissioning agent, in fact, this was the network show, and so really our real bosses were the network committee. And people would get really upset and say, well, we can't go on like this. People keep losing in this show. And I said, yeah, it's a real game and they die.
That's the joy of it, though, isn't it? That's the thing they were missing. That was the joy of it. It's so difficult to win it. It's special when somebody wins it.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why the international versions didn't really have the same tension to them. It's because they tended to have a win almost every episode.
If you take the prospect of sudden death out of the equation in a dungeon game, what are you left with?
Nothing.
Exactly. That was the reason, of course.
That was sightseeing.
The complex parallel introduction of rolling gameplay, which is almost never done again in any circumstances. It's incredibly expensive. It's difficult to do, but of course it allows you to kill people when they deserve to be killed. Johnson, of course, like Margaret Thatcher, was a rich vein of things to be tapped in parallel universes.
Yeah.
So you probably recognised on several occasions Margaret Thatcher in Knightmare, and indeed a lot of other people who deserve to be parodied and pilloried.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago you were on. You did an interview with Knightmare.com, and you mentioned what a shame it was Knightmare didn't carry on a few more years, so you could take the mickey out of New Labour. But I actually think you could do wonderful things with Boris Johnson today.
Everybody was slightly ready for New Labour because we did have that with Michael Foot. I'm not much older than you guys, but I mean, there was nothing new about poor old Jeremy Corbett because Michael Foot had played the part before.
Yeah.
But nobody has seen anything, I think, quite like, and even me with my long life and knowledge of 19th and 18th century politics, has seen anything like Johnson. No. Somebody without any recognizable moral compass. That's never happened before in terms of a prime minister. You know.
But that would mean
anyway, let's not get serious here. You know.
A perfect villain for Knightmare, therefore.
Yeah,
but,
absolutely.
A cartoon villain, obviously, but still a perfect villain for Knightmare.
So they didn't like the fact that there were more not any more losers than winners. There were hardly any winners.
Yeah.
And this scared the living daylights out of them because they didn't understand why people would want to watch people losing. Mainly because they were adults and they didn't even understand bloody children, you know.
They never do they?
Who are just as good at what's the awful German phrase? You know,
Schadenfreude.
The Schadenfreude as anybody else, and they grow up with it, and they glory in other people's mistakes.
Yeah, it's more than that.
Mistakes are much funnier than other people not making mistakes.
Absolutely, but it's more than that. It's a wonderful preparation for real life. Yeah. That you're being told winning actually is really difficult. You really do have to avoid mistakes.
A great preparation for real life is surrogate death. You know.
And that's what it was.
So a few months ago we spoke to Alec Westwood, and he mentioned being a little disappointed he wasn't invited back for the Geek Week episode. Did you have any plans to actually invite any of the old
that was
back?
So difficult. First of all, I couldn't get hold of him.
Oh, right, okay.
And look, Google came to me with 70 days to go before they wanted to do Geek Week.
Oh, it was as short term as that, was it?
Wow,
Oh,
okay.
I never
I
realised.
had no cast, no staff, right? Because Televirtual had been sold off and then crashed and burnt by its buyers during the 2008.
Intermedia Lab, was it? Intermedia Lab.
Intermedia Lab
Yeah.
was supposed to be the surviving operation, but basically they'd all gone, and I didn't have anybody, any staff. I should have said no because it was an impossible task to do it. But a lot of things went by the board because, and also there wasn't enough money in it either. A lot of things went, but it seemed just about worth having a go at, as long as it wasn't so bad that it was embarrassing. And I think it probably was as bad as to be embarrassing. But
I actually quite enjoyed it in patches. I thought the original edit was probably a bit needed a bit of work doing on it. But I actually quite enjoy the one with the shorter introduction. But the thing was saying, Alec Westwood wants to make absolutely clear to you.
Yeah, it would have been.
He would have loved to have done it.
It would have been good, and I fell back on Nick, who's worked for me in lots of other areas, but not in Knightmare, because I could get hold of him quickly.
That's fair enough.
I knew I could trust him. I mean, I'm a bit like I'm not. No, it makes me sound far too grand. I'm like the Coen brothers. I like to work with the people I can trust. And therefore, I tend to work with what looks like a repertory theatre of the same people time and time again. That's because if I don't know what I'm doing, at least I know they do, right?
Yeah.
This is what I mean.
Okay. Yeah. We'll pass the message on to Alec for you.
Please do and say I'm sorry, but I did try and get hold of him, and I think he changed agents or something like that. Unfortunately, I managed to get hold of Mark Knight. I wish I hadn't. There you go.
It's actually his agent died. I think it was a couple of years before you made it, so that was the reason why you weren't able to get hold of her.
We lost the track, and he was one of those who hadn't get close to the others either.
Yeah,
and occasionally that happens, right? I won't be bringing anybody back, of course. You do understand that.
Yeah, I do.
Because I won't be doing it again. I mean, I shouldn't have attempted to do the Google one, but there wasn't anybody else. And unfortunately, I said yes, whether that was hubris or whether it's sheer stupidity.
Maybe nostalgia.
And a bit of nostalgia as well.
Yeah.
Right? But anyway, it wasn't as, and quite a lot of it went in post in that to make it work, which is funny, because Knightmare almost had it was a duplex editing of editing two sides of a story together, and it had very little post-production in terms of what we think of as post-production nowadays, where everything is made, where you shoot for 3 hours in order to get 30 minutes, you know. Yeah. None of those things happened with Knightmare because they couldn't, because it had to be genuine in order to make it work.
Yeah. So if the illusion isn't there for the contestants, nothing will work properly.
Well, you look, with children, it's better because they're better at doing suspension of disbelief as opposed to suspension of belief. I mean, most children, as far as I'm aware, I was certainly one, grow up in other worlds of their own imagining quite a lot of the time. And most bright children do that. So to bring them into a world of my imagining was never a problem. They would have died to get in, right? It was the sort of one that they'd imagined, but they didn't have the colors and the tools to put it together.
Yeah.
Well, what gets me about the Geek Week episode is the contestants. You've got one of them who is obviously an original fan, and the other three were vaguely aware that the series existed, but as it goes on, they get more and more into it. It's quite fascinating to watch their attitudes change.
Given they were all over 20, I think it was, so that was rather interesting that the series could have that effect on people that were that old. So it's promising anyway.
Yeah, I mean, it could have been worse. I mean, and they were good eggs, all of them, and they took it. As soon as it really started, and we were throwing things at them, they took it about as seriously as a smart 10-year-old, and I can't say any higher than that.
There's a notorious moment just at the beginning of their quest where one of the advisors says you're in a room, and everybody seems to snigger very, very self-consciously about it. Was that moment actually scripted? Can you remember, or was it?
No, none of their stuff was. I've never scripted a player.
No, okay.
In my life,
right.
Neither have we ever planted things, reactions with them.
Right.
Okay. I've scripted the cast.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've over-scripted the cast, and certainly in the early days, for instance, Hugo, who was a find right from the start, but had little understanding of what we were doing. Mainly Bob, because I didn't either, so I couldn't explain it to him. You know, and when your boss doesn't know, that's even worse, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, Hugo. But I had some thoughts about how we should make this lead character, who was a host as well as being part of the dungeon.
Sorry, excuse me. There's been a car crash outside.
Oh, is that what it was?
1 second.
It's all right. Well, we were talking. It's good and very appropriate because we've just been talking about the Google. That was a bit of a car crash, you know.
I don't think it was that bad. I think there are things about it that didn't quite work as they were supposed to. But
go down and see if they're all right.
Actually, into the building. Oh my goodness! Right. Oh well, we got it on film.
Sorry about that.
There you go.
Heavens above. So it sounds like an alien invasion going on out there at the moment.
Yeah.
No, as I said, we're talking about scripting, and this is. We had a fallback script, but all of the stuff in the dungeon was based upon interactivity.
Yeah.
And it was based upon improvisation. So, I've used the parallel of Commedia dell'arte, right? Because it's a very good one, because there was no written script there, and you couldn't really have a totally written script because the kids couldn't see the script, and they couldn't follow it, and they were going to say something else, and they were always going to do something different. And very often they did. We spent a lot of time guessing how the players in the game would react to the scenarios before, right? And after a while, you get quite good at this. And the actors weren't good at it. And they said, before we go into a particular section, they'd say, I brief them, and they'd say, they will do this, 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 and this, and this. They said, how do you know this? Because don't forget, an actor, the last thing an actor wants to go on is going onto a scene with a live camera, right? And play a scene with somebody who doesn't know the script. It's a total anathema to it. I mean, it's brown trousers all round, you know. And that's just the ladies. So it was,
Alec Westwood was saying
so
things
they
to
didn't
me,
understand the principle that actually it's just critical path analysis, CPA. And what you're looking at is you're looking at the options that they were likely to take, and you have to start thinking like them. And in the end, they almost never do something which completely surprises you. And when it does, you just have to put your hand up in the air.
Did you often have to sort of send a message to the actors on screen because something unexpected happened? Did that happen all the time?
Well, they were usually it was in the studio. The director played the technology and everything else into the game, and I didn't have to tell the director about this, but I ran the game, and also the director did not rehearse the characters or anything else like that. I dealt with the entire cast, and I dealt with the competitors separately, of course, because you have to get that deep into it to make sure it's going to happen. I didn't always get it right, obviously, but we thank goodness I had some really not right from the beginning, but after a while we worked out which sort of actor or actress was going to be good at this sort of thing, and mainly they're the ones who aren't scared stiff because they start enjoying it. I mean, famously, I've told people, you know, in Studio E, there's long corridor of dressing rooms and everything else, and the kids were taken down to a green room at the end, and all the doors were closed until they were in the green room, and then we had a button flash to say they were safely out of the way. And the actors, all in their, very often in their, all their stage makeup and their costumes and their monster gear and everything else, would burst out. And if there was a team they didn't like, they'd say, "When are you going to kill him, Tim?" They were so bloodthirsty about it. But of course, it was the opposite. If there were teams that were playing well to them, right?
Yeah.
And working for them, they then became so partisan that when anything went wrong, they were going at me saying, "How dare you kill this lot?" They're charming, you know.
Did that ever lead to any conspiracies, or did you always resist it? Sort of.
I missed that. Sorry.
Did that ever lead to any sort of conspiracy sort of setups, or did you always resist the temptation?
No, not really. There was look. It was all complicated enough anyway, without inventing another layer of conspiracy theory.
I suppose so.
Mostly, it always worked better than you imagined, and sometimes it didn't. And in the early days, a lot of the problem where it didn't work was because we could not deliver the game fluidly and continuously. The technology did not allow us to give them as much game in a day as they wanted to play. So they used to be in the green room, in the holding area, for more time, three times longer than they were ever in any dungeon scene.
Yeah.
And some of them got bored. And it's not their fault, right? We just couldn't do it far. We just couldn't. The technology was so immature, and also our approach to trying to mangle it into a production form so often failed. Particularly the lighting issues with chroma key and color separation overlay are very, very critical indeed. And sometimes it would take an hour to light each particular scene. When in that hour, the team, which was a great team, was all up for it, was sitting there stuck in a boring green room playing card games or something.
And
they used to go off the boil.
Yeah.
And then when they go off the boil, they don't concentrate, they make silly mistakes, and then they die and they look stupid. And sometimes it was our fault and not theirs, right?
The famous one on that score is Akash and the three girls in season 2.
Yes.
Were they as bad as they came across? They only survived about 7 minutes, I think it was.
You're going to have to really refresh me here, because we had some some great all-girl teams, and we had some bad ones as well. You know,
they got a truth spell from a troll, and the way it was done, it kind of, looking back at it as an adult, it feels like they did so badly in the clue room that they had to go back and film this.
They're the only team who never got a riddle right in the clue room. They had to cast the truth spells.
Clue rooms are, in the end, they're weird decision places, because if they're critical, you've got to take the right things, and sometimes, mostly you would take the right things. Sometimes, if you do something really intuitive and clever with the wrong thing, we would give them a pass into the next level. That only happened. We made more game accommodations in level 1 because they were learning in level 1, and we expected them to make some mistakes. But later on, in levels 2 and 3, there were no forgiven things. Apart from anything else, when you've got something which you've designed an adventure which looks as if it's non-linear, but actually it is, behind the scenes, everything has got joining up bits and pieces. Now we can throw away some of the sections which are no longer relevant, and we can also add in a few additional ones which are simply puzzle rooms, sudden death or otherwise, about maneuverability, about standalone rooms, in other words, which aren't linked to anything else in the adventure. Many of the things were linked, and most of the dialogues with the actors were linked. If you just walked in and said, "Well, I'm not interested in talking to that character," and that character had a particular piece of which she wanted to give to you, but only if you asked for it properly and in an intuitive manner, then afterwards we knew that they weren't going to survive. Now, what did we do? Did we kill them straight away? Not always. And the reason for that is the structure of the standby teams and the whole structure of making rolling gameplay work. So I don't know whether you know this, but first team in the game is the game team. Right from the beginning, it follows the same rolling format. As soon as the game team is in game, their backup is called not to studio, but called to Norwich, and they are there. A team never started in game without the backup being no more than 5 minutes away from the studio, usually being looked after elsewhere. Then the next team became the standby team at home, waiting for the call. So in other words, in every series, the order of teams was absolutely critical, and we knew what they were. So if a team died in game, did something absolutely stupid, almost going into the first thing or something else, right? Okay, and there was no other way around it. They immediately, then we knew that we had about an hour and a half of them to shoot all of their sequence for leaving, right, going away, some of their pickups. I'll explain about pickups later on, okay? And after that, the other team had to be ready to go straight in. And sometimes a team was in waiting at the hotel, not allowed in the studio because you couldn't have two teams in the studio. We only had one holding area, and they would be there talking to each other and things like that.
Giving secrets
so
away.
The other team were in a separate hotel, and sometimes they would be there for 3 or 4 days because a particular team was winning and it was taking so long in studio. So you've got to understand that was that whole system was worked out and was lying in waiting, and the problems that we have was to continue to make continuous programs all the time, accommodated by sudden death, real decisions outside our control. So we reflected that and we didn't fake it. And I can tell you, we may have kept them in the game a few hours longer sometimes, and to put an extra couple of rooms in them, but they were always going to die because the decision that they had made that was wrong, they had made it, and it had finished them off. We just didn't finish them off straight away.
Yeah, it's what we refer to as losing status. It's what we refer to on the podcast as losing status.
Yeah.
Alec also mentioned that you had a plan for an awesome-sounding villain for him to play had he returned for season 3. He said it was some sort of snake-like creature. Can you remember that at all?
Yes, yes and no. I don't remember. And anyway, we never did it. But most of them, if it wasn't a big prosthetic that they had, because don't forget, prosthetics could take up to 2 hours prep in makeup. Particularly the big plastics ones. Some of the things that the big lizard creature, lizard, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that took ages to do, right? And it was a really complex thing. And of course, that means that as soon as we had to know, that's one of the reasons why he mainly appeared in dramatized events, in the snooping on the other side, you know.
Yeah.
In other words, the comedy.
The spyglass scenes.
Spyglass stuff, yeah. He mainly appeared in that because we could schedule those. I mean, in fact, when we started a new adventure, if we had time to, we were still waiting for a team to get it absolutely ready, and one had gone out very quickly, we would do all of the subplot, the backstory, in other words, which was found in the spyglass thing. We would go and record those separately, just as conventional drama. And then we played them back in, and it was a way of keeping the studio going and actually putting some, if you like, conventional production techniques into what was otherwise a very unconventional production.
The name Granitas obviously is a play on words of gravitas, and of course,
if you say so.
And of course,
it's a long time ago. I just remember giggling about it because I thought they're going to say, you only have to talk to young people about a certain age, and you always say bum, right? And they all roar into laughter, right? So,
yeah.
I still roar into laughter, and somebody says bum. But anyway, so we knew that it was going to come out as granitas, right?
Yeah.
And that was the real play on the words, and I can't even remember whether I even thought about gravitas or not at that point, you know.
Can I just make a little confession at this point? It was embarrassing considering I'm one of the oldest Knightmare fans out there at 47. the first time I heard that, the joke missed me completely. it went all the way up there.
Yeah.
It was only the second time I suddenly got it. Granite art, right? Okay. That's not very good for somebody who was nearly 13, I have to admit.
Well, don't. You can live with this, you know. I'm sure the shame will. There's worse things that you could.
After 35 years, no, the shame has not lifted, unfortunately.
No, to go back quickly to Alex. Alex was already, like all of the actors. We tried to give them two parts. It wasn't always possible. Sometimes because if they were one that was in a heavy prosthetic, then it spent too much time getting them ready for one, and there was no time to get them ready for the other. Yeah. Where possible, we gave them two parts, and they were deliberately very, very different parts to make certain that. So, for instance, the next jester along, Paul Valentine, who I think succeeded in Alex, he may not. There'd been one in between. It's too many years ago. I can't remember. He succeeded directly. But of course, he not only played the jester
Motley,
yeah, or he played Sylvester Hans, the sneaky thief and everything else, and they were so different. You couldn't have spotted, I'm sure, that it was the same actor in there at all, and because Paul was excellent at that, and Sylvester Hans was such a great character to write for. He almost wrote himself, you know.
I should say, the first time he played Hans, Paul Valentine's voice does rather drift up into Motley's towards the end of the scene.
Oh no, he may have done it first. Did you know what? I mean, I'm.
He may
I
still
probably think you may well be right, but it certainly, once he got into it, the timing of it and the sheer slyness of it, and Motley was because a very quick talker, and Sylvester Hans was not a quick talker, right, as well. I thought that was one of the better pairings. Some of the other pairings were the use of Mark Knight as other characters. Although Mark's got an extraordinary range and is very good at these things, I still found him less convincing than the Sylvester Hans ones, you know.
If you were to do Knightmare today, which of the characters would you keep and which would you get rid of? And
that's incredibly difficult. That's incredibly difficult to answer, dear boy. I mean, first of all, I don't have to answer it because the real answer is I'm not going to do it again. Right?
Of course.
But going back over things that you did in something as, how can I put it, as intuitive as this, it was making up its own rules anyway as it went along.
That's true.
Obviously, some things worked better than others. Right, but I'm not even sure that I'm a good judge of which ones did. In the end, it was the kids who, by their responses and by the fact they managed to suspend belief that they weren't standing in a stupid blue shoebox, right, in the middle of downtown Norwich, right, who made the judgments, and I think would still make them today. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a cop-out, isn't it? I honestly don't. I know some things didn't work well, but most of this related to the first two series, where we were finding out what worked and what didn't.
There are there's a few characters I think it's fair to say they are
stereotypes. Shall we say?
They represent attitudes of the time.
Yeah,
I believe.
Yes. So, I mean, but isn't that the same and comedy is a self-parody?
Yes,
and
of course.
Much of Knightmare, as you probably managed to catch on now, was comedic by nature. It was a parody, sometimes, not always an obvious one, because those were the tools that you get to play with if you're inventing a different world. Particularly a world which is going to be entered into and visited by people from our world.
Of course.
Okay. Right. They're just. I don't want to ask this question, make it sound too much like an accusation, but it's
Well, go ahead. It's not a problem.
Are there any characters?
I not only have an old skin, I have a very thick skin too.
Okay. Were there any characters that you put in Knightmare that you think I wish I hadn't included them because they're, frankly, slightly racist? Because I'm thinking Arwok in particular.
Well, he was.
Would you have left him out today?
He was obviously, but so of course. Look, you're probably a bit too young for this, but I mean, the funniest thing that Benny Hill ever did before he started doing Charlie Chaplin impersonations and not talking at all was his Chinaman, right? And the Chinaman was based upon the Benny Hill performance.
Right. Okay. So
and of course, it was full of racial cliches and things like that. But look, but it was affectionate.
Yeah.
Right? And I think that. Oh, look, it's so difficult, isn't it? I mean, nowadays, of course, it's even more difficult. Yeah. I mean, how Game of Thrones managed to get through what it got through, I think almost nobody's business.
I think it really helps that Arwok is generally such a likable character as well.
Yes.
Just thinking, it's not necessarily saying there was any bad intention behind it, but do you think I wouldn't do that today because it would probably cause an uproar, for instance? Because
I think we all know that what you do yesterday in changing social mores and political mores and everything else, you just have to. Any producer has to if they're going to succeed in any sort of business, going to have to pay attention to things like that. And the ones who ignore it nowadays are really walking on broken glass. So yeah, there was an area which I did regret because I basically, and it was my fault, I basically always told the cast that we were not doing pantomime. And yet sometimes I introduced pantomime elements into things. And we were getting great laughs. But the trouble is, you walk a very, very, very in heroic fantasy. You walk a very dodgy line between something which has got to be slightly scary and taken seriously, and just taking the piss completely.
Yeah. So some of Treguard's asides to the camera and exchanges with his assistant sometimes came across as slightly pantomime-ish. So
yes, they were, and again. We looked at each series and we thought, well, hang on a second. If it's getting too much like this, we'll try and stop it from becoming too much like this. But it was difficult because we wanted the laughs, we wanted the comedy, we wanted the scariness, we wanted the sudden death, and we wanted a damn good game, an honest game to play. And all of those elements sometimes are they can get in each other's way because they can be in conflict.
Yeah. So. I've written audio plays based on Knightmare, and one of the things I'm always having to slap myself across the back of the head for is writing lines for characters that are funny but clearly do not fit the character. When I was writing for Mogdred, it was hell because I wanted to give him a sense of humor, but he doesn't have one. You have to keep on sort of dragging yourself across the other side of the road before you get hit by the lorry of bad characters.
The best wizard, of course, was Hordris the Confuser because he was a pompous git. And he was played as a pompous git, right? And somebody who took himself far too seriously.
Most definitely.
And you could write, and he got into terrible problems because of what he was. And you could write the storylines for him easily because you wouldn't know in any particular set of circumstances just at what point he would be taking himself too seriously.
In his early appearances, he was actually my personal scariest character.
Yes.
Because you never knew what he was going to do. You didn't know if he was going to help the engineer or just outright kill them.
Well, we used to divide up the parts into camps, and we would call them powers that be, right? The powers that be were actually the good guys, not the bad guys in this, right? The opposition, who were always the bad guys, and then the non-aligned. And the non-aligned were allowed to change sides. In other words, in particular circumstances, they would work with one group. In other circumstances, they would work in others. And it made them very, very, very difficult to second guess. And certainly Hordris and his Chinese sorcerer's daughter and things like that were very much non-aligned.
We're just about to finish up Series 3 and go on to see Series 4, where it kind of changes from the David Rose hand-painted backgrounds to the photos of castles.
No, it doesn't change at that point. And in fact, David Rowe was still hand-painting scenes in Series 8.
Of course.
Yeah.
But we did try, as you know, we did start using video material and real castles and things like that, and then color changing and things like that to try and get more movement. We were one criticism we did have from the Children's Committee was that the show was a bit pedestrian. And they went by pedestrian, it's just somebody walking around another room.
Yeah.
So we tried to escape from that, and we tried to reflect that criticism.
It is impossible
sometimes
to
it
dispute
helped,
that. Yeah.
sometimes, quite frankly, it didn't.
Yeah.
The other breakthrough that you probably should spot is the transition of David doing all of his own lighting in scenes and Robert Harris's black overlay, which allowed us to relight scenes that David had already painted.
Okay.
Yes.
And after that, once we started using that technique, it became more atmospheric. And David deliberately put no lighting effects in his scenes at all, and left us to decide on it.
Yeah, we had a conversation with David Rowe about the lighting in each room, and it was quite fascinating to learn that he didn't do all the lighting effects.
Well, he couldn't.
No,
Because we were able to do lighting changes, which once he'd done them into the picture, that stopped us from doing changes.
Yeah.
So, for instance, if you wanted to have a lit torch affair or something like that, which we were moving towards and revealing things from darkness, etc., we couldn't do it. He would have to he'd have to paint 5,000 frames of the same thing. Whereas by using the device that we were using and laying a black template over the top of the scene and then wiping through it, we created a completely lit environment and a dynamic situation. And that was at Knightmare first, by the way. Nobody had done that before.
One of the things a lot of people notice about season 4 is sort of purple haze to the photos that were used for some of the backgrounds. What was the reasoning behind that?
You know, I don't know. We went out on location and shot film stuff in various castles, including the Robin Hood Castle in Kent and various others, and some of them were more successful than others. And then we wanted to treat them digitally so that they didn't. We were trying to make them look more graphic so that they would fit in with David Rose stuff, because David Rose stuff never went away.
Yeah.
And therefore, we were trying to make them unreal, and that was the reason for the colorization in them.
Okay.
And look, sometimes it almost worked, but I'll tell you, I was never really happy with that technique. We were, again, what we were trying to do, just with David and his still illustrations, we didn't have real VR because VR was not powerful enough at that time for it to be convincing, and it wouldn't have helped us with suspended disbelief because it would have just looked absolutely Mickey Mouse, if you pardon the expression. So it was another experiment by myself and my production team to try and do things with technology that technology was not mature enough to do with yet.
Yeah.
And from that point of view, it's not much point in agonizing over it, because after a while I pretty much stopped doing that anyway, because I just liked it so much and felt that none of the things that we were trying were working.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I frankly really hate watching season 4 because the purple haze is one of the main reasons for it. It's very monotonous. I understand what you were trying to do, but it didn't really work.
Well, no, but I'm not. I'm not as thick as you think I am. I mean, pretty much, I had to do something, and when it didn't work, I stopped doing it.
Yeah, that's the main thing.
Yeah,
that is the main thing.
You mentioned about introducing the passive paths, and it's been documented that you weren't a fan of the eye shield.
Well, I'm a fan of the eye shield in terms of it gave us a way into the spyglass series situation.
Yeah.
And the spyglass situation really transformed it because we were able to feed elements of backstory to them and let them discover things and take risks while discovering them. So it was both passive but a real gameplay at the same time.
Oh, okay.
So I was a fan of the eye shield for that. I was not a fan of the eye shield in terms of creating material so that you could see where the dungeoneer was going, right? Because, again, I didn't think it worked.
Were there any other possibilities that you considered that just didn't work straight from the go?
Well, look, if we'd have had powerful real-time environments in 3D, some of which we did have for the Google thing and things like that, it changes the situation completely. And indeed, nowadays, I mean, if you've only got to pay, no, don't bother. Skyrim is 10 years old now, right? And we could have died for material like we had in Skyrim, right? And because the idea of building a believable virtual world was something that we could only dream about almost. That was much of it had to be static, and why even later David's stuff was still working better than anything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is true. It is true. It was David's stuff had the otherworldliness sort of built in because it was straight from his imagination rather than what was on in the photograph. So it did work best, I think. I would say.
Yeah, I think so too. And I both, I'm both incredibly thankful for how well it worked and what David put into the series, and at the same time frustrated that we became over dependent on it in the end because we just couldn't replace it with anything more powerful.
Yeah.
And fidelity was always the issue. See, David's stuff right from the beginning was high fidelity. We didn't want low fidelity. We were forced into low fidelity and early real-time VR in the satellite game. It was appalling. I mean, but we had to do that.
The stage show Knightmare Live has helped rekindle the passion that many people have for the show. So we realise, obviously, it's an unofficial tribute, but how involved were you in the production of Knightmare Live?
Oh, I was involved in a conversation which lasted around about 30 minutes with Paul Flannery. And he said, we're going to take the piss. And I said, I should be extremely upset if you weren't. And he said, well, do you want to see the scripts? And I said, no, I want you to make me one promise only. I said, it's going to be funny, isn't it? And he said, yes. He said, yes. I promise it will be. And he didn't let me down.
No, he didn't. Definitely not.
And of course, it's both incredibly critical, but at the same time, it's very affectionate at the same as well, right? Yes. And I think that comes across in the show, and I think that's why it's such a successful show. And it also helps these awful 40-something and 30-something now, because they can go and sit amongst 600 others in a West End theatre and basically laugh at themselves just as much as they're laughing at the stage.
It amazes me that no one's actually fallen off the stage yet, although apparently they did get quite close in the last performance.
They've had all kinds of accidents there, but they do very silly things, but it's great, And they're a very talented bunch, and they, in some ways, of course, they pointed us into ways in which lessons which we could put into a new version of Knightmare. But that's another story, and it's not my story to tell, I think.
You said earlier that Knightmare has almost always been under option by some TV company or another.
Well, there's only one reason for that, and the reason is sitting on your side of the bench at the moment. All over Britain, we have these Knightmare fans, and some of them, of course, are now commissioning editors. One of them was the news editor of Broadcast Magazine. Another one was a commissioning editor at Channel 4. Another one was married to Kirsty Walk, and was running Scottish television, So they just turn up, and sooner or later they think, Knightmare, we could do that.
Yeah. There have been a couple of examples recently of shows that are very similar to the Knightmare format. There was one in particular, name of which escapes me, was a sci-fi show where the kids sitting in their bedrooms guiding an adult actor.
Every now and again somebody says, this is like Knightmare, and I go and look at them. I think, no, it's not.
Yes, Raven.
Raven, yeah. I mean, I'd like to see how many sudden death options they had in those shows.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing to remember is, and just before you should, I'm sure in other sessions like this with other Knightmare people who failed to grow up, and I know that you don't object to that as a
not in the slightest.
No, I have pointed out that because Knightmare right from the beginning was very, very hard to make much production time in one day. And at one point, I remember a famous day, we only made 8 minutes in the one day. And I took the team together. I said afterwards, they're going to pull our permission on this, right? We can't do this. We've got to make we've got to make a show a day. We don't have to make 2 shows a day. But we've got to make a show a day. And the only way we can get around this is we're going to have to really sharpen up. And the timeouts have got to shrink and get less and less and less. And the times in, when the game is on, right, they've got to become more and more and more. And we must also get more material out of it. If it takes a long time to change scene, and that was the big problem, we must get more material out of the scene that we're in. And in the end, we did get better. But it was so difficult that we could not waste anything. Now, most shows today, let's take leaving aside Crystal Maze, which is unfair to criticize next to it because it was doing a different task in a different way. But most shows that we have, let's take Have I Got News for You? It's a BBC half hour, which means it's 25 minutes, right? 25 minutes of time, okay. They run for 4 times that time in order to get that show ready, and then they edit it down.
I was in the audience for the Boris Johnson episode.
So you know how long it all takes, right?
3.5 hours.
Yeah. Well, sometimes it's even longer than that. And somebody would say that if you can edit down, that used to be called the shoot ratio in my business, right? So you were 2 to 1, 1 to 1. That's 1 to 1 is like live because nothing's missing from it and everything else. We used to edit Knightmare, a 24-minute Knightmare down from no more than 30 minutes of material. And most of the stuff that we took out were boring bits when they couldn't find the door because they were, and they'd solved everything. They'd done all the interesting stuff, and they would try. Now, quite frankly, I think I'm not ashamed of editing out the long pursuit of somebody trying to find a door and go out of it.
You have no reason to believe me. I thought fussing that much about the precise alignment of walking towards the door. You don't need to worry about that. We know what you're trying to do. Just move on to the next scene.
We used to laugh I used to laugh when watching, because I know obviously Jacques Antoine quite well because he tried to license a show from me. Jacques Antoine, of course, is the French producer who invented the Treasure Hunt, and also he invented the Keys to Fort Boyard. And by extension, he also invented Crystal Maze, because Crystal Maze is just a renaming of the Fort Boyard license. Right? And when Richard O'Brien used to say, running around, say, "Hurry, right? We've got no time." And the teams were looking at him because they knew that they had an awful lot of time.
If they're taking too long to move between the zones, you just stop the camera and then restart a bit further along.
It reflected, of course, that in TV, we confuse pace with narrative, and we think that there can be no narrative because we think that we misjudge the audience and think that they are, unless we do feed them an awful lot of something quickly, they're going to go off the boil and hit another button and change over, etc. Yeah. Actually, you really just have to. The great dramas and things like that sometimes aren't at all pacey.
No, indeed.
Right? And it's the same with game. Game has to have can you imagine turning a football match or something like into something like that? If the edited versions would be even more ridiculous than Match of the Day Live, right? Yeah. Which is hard enough to follow to make sense of any particular football match.
It's got to be said. It's got to be said. Ever since Match of the Day decided to do cover every single game in the Premier League, a lot of the coverage is bite-sized stuff. You get about 5 minutes on certain games, so it does happen. And it is ridiculous.
The point was I'm just saying I was quite proud of the fact that we threw so little away, but mainly the truth of it is we bloody had to, because it was so hard to come by. We couldn't afford to throw it away.
So then,
just on that sort, did you ever cheat slightly by having the action on screen and then cutting to the reaction of the advisors, but actually while the action was going on, rather than afterwards? If you take my meaning.
One of the biggest problems was three-dimensional room puzzles in the vectored rooms, and you falling through the floor. Well, fairly obviously you can't fall through the floor. So those were done as pickups. What happened was when we decided a team had actually done something which would have caused death, we would then sound the gong in the studio, right? Okay. They knew that they died, that their dungeoneer had died, right? Okay. And then we would at that point explain to them, right, that for the purposes of the show, we were going to give them a much more spectacular death than the other pathetic one, which they engineered. In other words, just falling to the floor or something like that because they couldn't fall through it. And we do a quick retake we do their pickups against blue. So the dungeoneer would just put his arms up in the air, legs slightly apart, look in dismay, and of course by then we'd have picked him up and be throwing him down into a void.
So that's how it works.
That would happen in post-production. But look, they understood that, and they didn't in any way. We said, look, do you want to look good when you died, right? Because you're dead, right? Yeah. Or do you want to look even more pathetic, right? And none of them ever failed to cooperate at all.
Very good.
And we didn't hide from them. We didn't hide from them what we were doing and why.
There's that infamous Simon sidestep to your left moment in season 4 when I think everybody remembers that one.
We never killed one who didn't deserve it. I can tell you that. And occasionally we preserved them in game a little longer and made them look as if they were not quite as bad as they were, right, for our own purposes and for theirs.
Yeah, is it that moment though when Simon does start side to the left, his arm suddenly swings outwards, and I've always thought, was there something literally there that tripped him over?
That was part of a reenactment. Some of them were better than others. Right. We got better at it as we went on, if you know what I mean.
Right. Okay. I've been wondering for a long time about that. Was that done after the effect, as an after effect, or was it actually live?
No, we tried to play the game as accurately and as honestly as possible, and then did a bit of augmentation when we thought it was necessary.
Yeah. That's fair enough. Nobody can call that real cheating.
The show is obviously no stranger to controversy in the early days, especially. Was there ever a point where you were worried you'd maybe gone a bit too far for children's television?
No, we did hit a problem with Mary Whitehouse and her viewers' situation, particularly after the Hungerford massacre in the Bottom Forest, when that guy who was well and truly into Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing, I had to go before one of the program commissions and explain. I said, look, we knew all about role-playing. This isn't role-playing. our kids play themselves. They're not in. They are operating in a fantasy setup, and if, in fact, wherever we describe it, we say, "Look, this is not real."
Yes,
Although occasionally we used to say, "Or is it?"
Or is it?
Yeah. I get a bit
Isn't
annoyed
it?
myself when people just say Knightmare is a Dungeons and Dragons game. It's
Well,
not.
it isn't at all, because in Dungeons and they've obviously never. These people who've said it have obviously never played Dungeons and Dragons.
Exactly.
I know it's not for the obvious reason, right?
This is a universal rule. This is a universal rule that I've noticed. It should be studied in science. People who try to describe a TV series by shorthand like that have never actually seen it. Every single time you realise.
Yeah, well, you're so right, but it is inevitable that these forms of comparisons, which are all odious or not,
yeah, they
are always going to be about. And the other thing is, if you operate in a children's area where you are taking advantage of the fact that they have enhanced, because they haven't yet got cynical and lost the idea of imagination yet, right? You've only got to watch some small boy or girl of 7 or 8 playing in a fantasy situation in the most boring place, because it's the only place they've got, and it's become their own world, to realize that that if only we could keep and hang on to that throughout our lives, we would have created something really good.
Yeah.
But it does mean that they are vulnerable to being exploited.
True.
And did we exploit them? Yes, but not in that manner. And certainly not. We didn't confuse the role-playing sagas, and we were fully conscious of the Dungeons and Dragons criticism, and the criticism of, and also its permutation, unfortunately, into criminal activity, which has happened.
I wouldn't say you exploited them. I'd say you tapped the resource there. I don't think
that's a kind of way of putting it, and I'll go with that.
Yeah, I don't think exploited. You got to understand, you gave something back to them, which was a really great adventure that every kid who hadn't done it wanted to do as well. So yeah, I wouldn't use the word exploited. I'd say it was definitely symbiotic between the production and the kids.
So Feathered Menace is the alias of our youth correspondent, who's a 9-year-old nightie experiencing the show for the first time, as she reviews episodes from her perspective. The perspective of someone who was of the intended target audience of the time. So she's recorded her questions in audio format, which we'll play here.
She bullies me as well.
She does.
I'm deeply intimidated by her.
What inspired you to make Knightmare?
Frustration, and the fact that I had just failed with what I thought was creating one of the best consumer programs for testing motor vehicles, and it had been rejected. And it had been rejected because it was so effective that ITV felt that some of the car companies would cancel their advertising if we showed it.
Wow!
That is cynical.
They took me in and they said, "Sorry about this, Tim. It's a really nice, good program, and we're very ashamed about the way it's been rejected. But perhaps you might like to do a game show instead, because they're short of game shows." And so I did a non-game show.
I'd have thought today you could point to the success of Top Gear and go, nah, that was right all along.
Exactly.
Well, I must say I'm not really.
I'm not a fan of it.
I'm not a fan of Top Gear.
Maybe,
and as a former motoring journalist, I don't think it does anything for that genre at all.
I agree, but it does show there is an audience for it out there, a very big audience.
But it shows there's an unnatural and unhealthy audience for laddism, right? Okay.
I suppose that's one way of looking at it, I suppose.
Who was your favourite character?
Well, that's very hard to say, because if it's not Hugo, then it's somebody. I had a favourite dungeon character. And I think that's probably got to be Lord Fear, right?
Of course.
Yeah, and he's a joy to write for. He's closely followed by Sylvester Hands, right? But Lord Fear really can hold it all together.
Lord Fear can say most of the things about the kids that you want to say about the kids.
Yes, that's right. And also he can do all the bad stuff, which I'm not allowed to do. Right? So it's great.
It's sort of James Bond side to him almost. But when I was writing the plays, I love writing for Lord Fear. I cannot deny it. It's you can do all the things you can't do with Monk Dreads. It's the contrast.
So it's probably got to be Lord Fear, and Mark is not an easy person to work with, but he's a great person to work with, and also I've used him. I used him a lot in Time Busters as well, and he never ever let me down, and he gave me some great. The rather sad thing about Mark Knight in Knightmare is because of being the Lord Fear figure, he didn't get to do as much genuine interaction and interplay with the Dungeoneer and the team. And that's a shame because he's bloody good at it. Right?
I always think when this subject comes up, Barry Fawn at the end of season 7, that would have been a fantastic chat show between Lord Fear and Barry. It would have been fantastic. Wogan would finally have been superseded.
How long did it take for you to make an average Knightmare episode?
To begin with, we weren't making much more than half an episode a day, and that really showed in the continuity of the gaming by the kids, because that's an unfair thing they do. We did get rid of by tightening up on things, and also we got rid of all of the things, all of the standard descriptives in a TV studio. So we never said action or cut after the series 2. These were replaced by game on and time out.
Yeah, very good.
So we started using, in other words, we converted the television crew, and they're professionals, and they all then stopped using any of the things they've been using throughout their careers, right? And started using game references.
It's almost like referees instead of TV makers. One of the things that we also notice, especially during season 2 and season 3, is the actual description to the audience is constantly lowering rapidly. The first season, Treguard must have given the rules to the riddle contests immediately after the Warmonster had already described them in almost every episode. And he, at the start of every quest, he was giving the team the full rules rundown.
Yeah, this in gaming terms is called, and also it exists in drama as well.
Yeah,
it's called signposting.
Yeah,
and some shows are very guilty of not signposting enough. But most, particularly ones like ours, which were in development, and we weren't quite sure either of the audience or of the significance, we probably started off by signposting not enough. In Time Busters, the BBC were always hammering on to me about not making assumptions about the audience and saying we should signpost more, and we should graphic signposts, and we should do this, and we should do that. So if you want to see an example of over signposting, I don't think you need to look at Knightmare. We did over signpost, and then we slowly started to probably, as usual, swing too much in the other direction.
I think a lot of us in the audience were quite happy to get rid of the full rules rundown. Perhaps it did get to the point where a newcomer would be a bit lost, but I think
as I said, don't forget. Series 1 and Series 2 were very much in transition.
Yeah,
there was no real narrative story. There were no separate storylines. Also, the earlier ones, right up into Series 4, we would write each adventure as one piece. We stopped doing that because we were throwing away too much material, and the actors were cutting their own throats. You probably know that this resulted in a situation where in any given quest, every level 1 would lock into the next available level 2.
Yeah.
right? So we never, if they died in level 1, we didn't throw away the 2 and 3 that were going to follow.
The 2 and 3 were then pushed over onto the next
Absolutely,
terminal. Cool. That was
it wasn't just that we were wasting less material. We were wasting less rehearsal time.
Yeah.
Less learning by the actors, everybody, and also less graphic material prepared by David Rowe, which sometimes was not used because we never got to it.
Absolutely, yeah. It's all just part of the learning process, though, isn't it? Really, rather than
absolutely, we were learning. It was and still is the ultimate development program in that it was always changing. It was almost organic by its nature, not deliberately, but because it had to be in order to deliver what it was supposed to deliver.
It had to be at the cutting edge, didn't it, of visual technology and.
Well, he didn't manage to do half of those things, of course, because we didn't. I mean,
or at least you had to give the
later on in Televirtual, we invented the term bleeding edge. This is when you think you're ahead of the game, but actually you're hemorrhaging.
So as long as you give the impression that you're at the leading edge to the audience, you'll get away with it, though.
Yeah. Well, there are pain factors involved here.
Yes, there would be.
Right, if we move on to the Patreon questions now. So our first question is from David N. Rabbit, and he wants to know, is there anything that you would have done differently looking back on how Knightmare was produced and set up?
Where do we finish? Start.
We've only got 28 hours left. I hope
I think he should be congratulated. Please pass it on to him, asking the ultimate impossible question. Right? Okay. The answer is yes, 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 and there isn't time. And also, some of it would be valid, not be valid now, because some things that are a problem in the environment in which they are first used, they are no longer a problem tomorrow.
Yeah.
Because particularly if you're on the leading edge at the time, and I think we were not on it. I think we were dangerously exposed as being in front of it. Okay. You obviously are going to hit all kinds of issues which are inappropriate, and you don't know until you've tried them. But most of them would not be a problem any longer. So therefore, why would I regret them? It's too late for that anyway.
Yeah. So that's a healthy attitude. That's a healthy attitude.
Yeah. As if there had been more Knightmare after the shorter 8th series, what ideas would you have tried to implement?
I think we would have started developing more backstory and more narrative. I think that in some ways, this is going to sound odd, in some ways, I almost don't regret that it finished. Now, I did at the time, and I bitterly resented it, right? But the fact remains is that we were already losing the original audience demographic that we were allowed to go for, which was anything between basically 8 and 16. Now we were divorced. We weren't even allowed to count anybody who was older than 12 by the time that we were finishing off. So though we were still getting these huge figures, they were figures that they included figures that we were demographic thing, all the adult stuff and everything else, we weren't allowed to count it any longer.
As I say, it was the people who were with Knightmare originally who were the ones who were still watching it, but they were now outside of the original demographic.
They basically took our audience away from us, even though our audience was still there enjoying it. You know?
Yeah, it was insane. It was still wonderful.
We would have had to meet the requirements. We would have had to make the whole thing a bit like CBeebies. You know, it would have had to get younger and younger and simpler, and all of the comedy and all of the parody and all of the satire would and most of the scariness would have had to have been weeded out. Yeah. We'd have been left with something which wasn't worth doing.
We were sort of introduced by somebody from Playbus, and it's a horrible idea, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's a horrible.
What a horrid way to die.
Yeah,
how much better to be plunged off a cliff top accidentally, right, into a sea of swimming sharks. You know.
Let it die. Yeah,
That's
let
a
it die.
decent death, isn't it? You know.
That's a spectacular death and a way to die with your dignity still.
Yeah, we had that one lined up,
preserved.
by the way. It was very good. I nearly used it. I nearly used it in the Google revival, but the sharks weren't ready.
That's a shame. I'd have quite liked to have seen that.
Okay, you sort of already answered this one, but were there any times when you had a solution in mind, but the Dungeoneer came up with something unexpected that you thought was as good or better?
Yeah, the answer to that is, I mean, how could that not be the case when you I mean, the teams were actually, on the whole, they were cleverer than some of them. Some of them, for various reasons, didn't perform as well as they could have done, and that's mainly because we were failing to deliver enough game to them to keep their attention, and to not, and that was our fault rather than theirs. But some of them came up with some great ideas, and when they were good ideas, and when we found ways that we could adapt the story, because the most important thing is to build a structure that can adapt. It can react. Like it's easy. It's easy in the terms of an interactive interview or encounter between a non-player character, right, and a player character. That's a very simple thing to do. When they come up with a completely different concept, if you can, you write the concept into the storyline.
Yeah. Are there any particular instances that stick in your mind at all?
No, and I know that there were, but the trouble is that there's so much material, right, and it's such a huge gap in time now.
Yeah.
That I wouldn't be able to give you. It's only worth attempting to answer that question if you can do it accurately and honestly. And I can't remember it well enough to do that.
Peter Pulsford wants to know what would be your favourite show to cross over with. So maybe characters from Knightmare appearing in another show, maybe such as Time Busters or something.
Oh, you know, I've never given that any thought, and I'm not quite sure that I could give it a sensible one now. We didn't cross over characters. We reused our actors because we already knew they had gone down a hard road with us and learned about. They call themselves interactors in the end.
Yeah.
And 2 or 3 of them set up businesses doing interactive development and sometimes for corporate purposes and things like that. And they did it very effectively. Certainly, Tom did that, who was
Tom Carroll.
Tom Carroll, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so did the guy who fronted, who was basically the Mr. Big and Bad in Time Busters, right? He was the baddie character, and he was excellent. But no, we didn't move characters between because they would look out of date in other worlds. They were designed for their own worlds, and their own backstories. So I wouldn't have done that anyway.
I've often found crossover stories for their own sake do tend to come across as doing it for their own sake.
Are you enjoying the many parodies and tributes online, such as Lego Knightmare?
I haven't seen them all. I'm hoping if anybody, if there's any I missed, you've got my email now. Please send me the links.
Of course.
I'm quite a busy person for somebody who is not actively producing. As you know, I run a drama consultancy as well, and and I also do a few other things. And to be honest, I don't really have as much spare time as people imagine. So, but I have always enjoyed the parodies so far, and I've never seen one actually that was. I've seen some are better than others.
Yeah,
they've all had one thing in common. There's always been a palpable and obvious element of homage and affection towards the format.
Yeah.
And that in itself I've never seen a vicious one, right? For instance, or I've seen ones that really do take the piss, but that's fair enough. As long as it's funny, it's not an issue.
David Thompson would like to know, disregarding real life obstacles such as budgets, if Knightmare never stopped and was still on the air today, what would it be? Would it have been? What would it been in 2000 and 2010? How would have it evolved? I think he's trying to say.
Well, I think one thing is that it would have had to move into a wider demography, in the same way that computer gaming was in its infancy when Knightmare first started. And I don't think it could have been the prisoner. We've already covered this when I explained that, you know, if it hadn't been pulled in 1993, the only way we could avoid being pulling would be to basically have sanitized it and to have brought it down to the audience that we were told to address, as opposed to the audience that we wanted to address. So I think that it would have been very hard for it to remain in transition in those circumstances when we were under pressure to stop doing what we wanted to do.
So maybe the ideal thing would have been, if it was possible, to move it to like maybe a 6 o'clock time slot.
Well, I mean, I made one show for Janet Street Porter in Def 2 for the so-called youth slot. But the BBC were having trouble with that soon, and that very quickly went when Janet didn't get the job of BBC Chief Controller, and ended up on live television and doing other things and being a chat show, a panel person, you know.
I've always thought a more mature Knightmare would have been ideal for somewhere around 8 o'clock on Channel 4. Because that was where the sort of the Crystal Maze sort of things were going anyway.
So. I mean, precisely, but it didn't happen, and so I can't.
That would have been a nice way of avoiding the dumbing down.
I quite like getting what if questions, but in this particular case, the scenario that he's pointing out, he's describing, is one when it didn't finish and it carried on.
Yeah.
And if it carried on, as I've already pointed out, the price of its survival carrying on would be watered down.
Yes.
Yeah. I imagine you would probably have, after a while, you'd have probably wanted to leave it anyway, even if it had carried on and it hadn't, without being watered down. I imagine you'd have wanted to get away from it eventually, because after about 10 years,
I can't answer that one because I never had the opportunity. It was snatched from us when it was almost at the height of its success, and it was getting better and better and better, right? And it was a bizarre thing to do, and I know the background to it, and I know the politics of it, and I know it was because it was about political and people who were appointed, and jealousy between ITV companies, right, and things like that. But in the end, it didn't make any difference because, as I said, our world, our real-time world, as opposed to our fantasy world, was changing. Professional environment, program making environment we were in was changing, and it was not in our favor.
The irony, of course, is that today a program on this scale would absolutely kill for an audience of about 6 million. All the extra channels that are around now. That's the irony, isn't it?
You're making very good points here, but the fact remains is like anything else. This is now it's now futile conjecture. You know?
True. It is.
And Jason Carl, who has been just absolutely great as in helping us actually get this interview together. He would like to know, where did the name Treguard originate from?
Oh, well, look, I was playing around with things, and I wanted something which was simple that sounded Celtic, so I went for Cornish. Because Trey is the prefix to lots of Cornish names, right, and things like that. I wanted something that was Celtic. I wanted something. The idea being that because I'm part English, part Irish, and a little bit Welsh as well. I'm a sort of bastardized Brit, you know. And I therefore, that was the reason. I tried another couple of names. It just came. Guard sounds vaguely military,
Militarist,
right? Okay. and Trey was from the Cornish, and that was where it came from.
Awesome. His thinking was that it came from the fact that he was guarding the 3 advisors, so he was thinking Trey as
Well,
in 3.
Jason's a great favourite of mine, and his life has been full of theories. You know, of course, that he's a former dungeoneer, right?
Yes.
And he collaborates with me in other elements, and he's a very useful member of an unofficial team that does a lot of work they don't get paid for.
Yeah.
So there's the
so that's why I will always indulge him, even when he gets it wrong.
That'll be great reassurance to him. There was a rumor on the Knightmare forums about 15 years ago that Treguard was actually had some kind of Norse origin to it, something to do with the Vikings. But you're saying that's definitely not true.
It's not true.
Good, not true. Okay,
although of course, the whole business of the Norse legends and the gods and the Loki character, which is the playful Joker, who is really actually the devil, you know.
Yeah.
Is fertile ground for almost anything you want to adapt it into.
Yeah, that reminded me of some of the things that Alec Westwood said to me in the interview just before Christmas.
Yeah,
I'll send you a link to it so that you can listen to him. Some of the ideas he has about the Joker from Batman will very definitely chime with that.
Well, the whole thing. Well, look at the. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the lovely Lee Mack episode on dogging and the clowns thing that was running a few years ago, and people were dressing up as clowns and really scaring people, etc. And of course, the whole certain elements of commedia dell'arte, which included clowning and scaramouche and things like that, are, how can I put it? They're both funny and scary at the same time. And because they're funny, they're even scarier than if they weren't funny. So this is fertile ground for lots of things and lots of imagery and lots of character things that work well in situations where you need backstories, and you want them to, you want the character to intrigue rather than just perform.
So the idea is what they're doing is really so ridiculous you laugh at it, and then you realize they actually mean it completely seriously. It makes it 10 times scarier.
Yes, that sort of thing. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. The Joker, definitely.
Yes.
Just one thing. You're saying that Treguard is half Celtic, sort of thing. Where did?
Well, that was the sort of backstory because don't forget that when we first launched Knightmare, I was doing some adventure books for Transworld, which were running with the thing. It was all part of doing program support and everything. I shouldn't have done it because I didn't have time, and in the end, a very good other writer took over writing them. And took
another
away
David
the burden from me, thank goodness.
Another David, but he always wrote Treguard as an Anglo-Saxon rather than a Briton.
Yes, that's because I wrote the original story, and then after that he was stuck with the backstory. You see,
right?
He probably made it better job of it than I
had. He also wrote Pickle as an imp rather than an elf, I seem to remember as well. So
well, I think the less theories about Pickle, the better, really.
I would agree. I'm glad I'm not the only one who says that. I thought I was on my own there. No. Get Treguard drunk and find out what he thinks. We've already established that he doesn't need to get very drunk to let us know what he thinks of Pickle.
Oh, yes.
Just put him in front of a TV camera and he's away.
Okay, we've reached the end of the questions that we have here, but just before we go, are there any developments in the world of Knightmare that you're able to tell us about? Anything coming up or anything?
We have a new franchise bidder. Actually, only 3 days ago, right?
Oh, right.
And it's actually one he's a great nighty, and it's WAG Entertainment, and they're a big London-based independent. with lots of market. They do stuff for Netflix as well, right? And they've lots of market in both the States and here. Stephen wants to play the game with adult game with personalities. We've come up with an hour-long format which will still allow. It will finish with one team in, right, all the time, but will still allow sudden death. So we're going to, when people die, we're going to kill them. But they will then go in. They will then. So each time that happens, we kill a Dungeoneer. He returns and joins the rest of the team as a ghost.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see.
Oh, wow.
And one of the others goes in and replaces him as the live body.
It's a little bit like the French version of Knightmare, isn't it?
And they, as it goes through the hour, right? They assemble into a rogues gallery, so there could be as many spooks in there, and they can still talk. But of course, they will be spooked. You'll be able to see through them and things like that.
I'm actually slightly disappointed by that. When you said that you'd still have sudden death, I was thinking, does that mean that if they die 20 minutes into the episode, we get to watch them being tortured in blood-soaked agony for 40 minutes?
The big problem is the problem is they're playing with personalities.
Yeah.
So we can't waste them, and also they can't go on standby because these people have schedules and everything else that costs money. So we have to come up the way you have to play to the strengths and weaknesses. And one of the things I didn't want to do was to stretch out a show and make it like an escape room, right? Completely like an escape room.
Yeah.
Where they did an hour, and if they hadn't gone out at the end of it, there'd be no sudden death on the way, and it'd just be rather a disappointment and a wet fart on leaving, you know.
Yeah, it wouldn't.
No tension.
So this allows us to still kill people.
Yeah.
And to still allow them to pose the sort of problems to them that need life or death decisions.
So is it still going to be called
and we think
Knightmare,
it'd be comedically very funny. We don't know whether it's going to happen yet. It's they begin pitching I think next week.
Awesome.
And these things have been almost signed, sealed and delivered before now and haven't happened. So we don't get overexcited about these things. The only thing I can say is it's very good. We have a new computer game project which is in hand as well, and I can't tell you too much about that because it's but it involves artificial intelligence, which, as you know, is something that I'm also a community I work in, right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. I've already got a wonderful idea for a first team. Get together some actors who used to be on Knightmare and see how they cope at the other end of the relationship. Get Alec Westwood, Mark Knight, and Cliff Barry.
That's an interesting lot. Yeah.
It would definitely be interesting watching them.
Well, I'm very surprised that if they were all available, I'm very surprised that Paul Flannery hasn't. Because Paul's always looking for how can I put it, cannon fodder for the show, right? And
well, if this goes ahead, he's going to have acres of it.
I think.
Look, there's no point in getting too excited about prospects for Knightmare because we have seen it all before and it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So just fingers crossed, I think.
We do remember Knightmare VR and the Knightmare Demonstrator, and it looks really like had so much potential and nothing happened with it. So we know not to start shouting from the rooftops about it, but it's still a possibility.
Okay, that's all we've got time for today. We'd like to thank Tim Child for joining us and answering our questions, and we'd also like to thank Jason Carl for helping to set up the interview and also for his help in finding guests for the rest of the podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, we're at NightmarePod. If you want to support the podcast, we're NightmarePod on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, here's a shout out to keepers of the Book of Quests, Peter Polsford, David N. Rabbit, and our newest supporter, Peter McIntosh. Advisors Benjamin Bloom, Peter Sidon, David Thompson and Stephen Whalen, and Dungeoneer Peter Corridge. Support us on Patreon at Dungeoneer level or above to get your name mentioned on the podcast. Higher level perks also receive merchandise, have access to exclusive episodes, and if you pledge as a keeper of the Book of Quests, we'll even offer you the chance to be a guest on the podcast. Our website is nightmarepod.co.uk, and if you're looking for Temporal discussion merchandise, including t-shirts, stickers, and other products, it's at nightmarepod.redbubble.com. You can email us at podcast@nightmarepod.co.uk. And just keep telling yourself,
it's only a podcast,
isn't it?